You're listening to Criticaleye's Asia Leadership Podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Hello and welcome to the Criticaleye Asia podcast, inspiring leaders to succeed. I'm Yuan Shao, Marketing and Communications Manager at Criticaleye, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's episode. Our podcast covers the topics at the forefront of business leaders' minds, always topical, thought-provoking, and designed to provide insights from leaders and peers to bring amazing results, unpacking energy and making it bite-sizable. And in today's conversation, we'll be delving into an incredibly relevant topic for leaders today, corporate governance. As the governance landscape continues to evolve, understanding the key elements that make a board effective is crucial for any aspiring board member. Joining me today is Wong, an experienced board chair, professor of leadership, and global speaker on corporate governance. Suyan, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Before we get into the heart of today's topic, could you please share a little bit about your background and the journey that led you to where you are today?
Thank you, Coco, for the warm welcome. It's a delight to be here. Perhaps I can rewind a little bit in terms of the journey that I've been on. So I actually spent most of my career as a strategy consultant and then into the human capital and organization development and leadership space. So over the past 15 or so years, I've served on a variety of different boards in Singapore, across Asia, in the US, Australia, and they've really been quite varied. So one of the things that I've found great learning for myself and hopefully able to contribute in different ways is depending on whether a board is privately held or a listed company or private equity backed, or maybe it's a startup or even a nonprofit, the lens that you bring into that structure is actually quite different. And so over the course of the 15 or so years, I've had the chance to serve on many different permutations of boards. And I think when I look at that portfolio, it's quite a unique vantage point in terms of understanding the dynamics of different types of boards and the challenges that each type of organization faces. So that's been my journey, and looking forward to getting more into the details.
So, given that you work with such a wide range of organizations, I imagine each brings its own unique dynamics. Could you please share your insights on how the strategic focus tend to differ across this type of companies? And how does that impact the board's role in shaping a long-term vision for the company?
I'd say that there are similarities and there are differences. At the heart of it, every organization has a purpose, has a mission, what it's trying to do, and where it is looking at in terms of its evolution for the future. So that's, at a common level. And there are common types of challenges in terms of how do you take strategy, translate it into organization, culture, execution, results, right? So there's certain common threads. However, I've also come to appreciate that depending on the shareholding structure of the organization, or even just the type of organization might be, what you look at is different. So let me give you a few examples. I served for a time on a government-linked company. Actually, it was the company that's actually Singapore's media company. And in that situation, for example, you need to think about the different types of stakeholders that are involved. And so there are, the ministry might be involved. You've got the public, of course. You've got the majority shareholder. So those are elements that would influence the way you think about the trade-offs, the constraints, and the opportunities. In another situation where it was a listed company, but with a major private equity ownership stake, you would look at private equity time horizon, because the private equity funds tend to have funds. The life of those funds would vary. And then in those situations, you're looking at, well, what is it that you aim to achieve over that particular time period? I'm on the board of another company, which is a family-owned company. It's privately held. And in this particular case, that organization, we're looking at an 8-generation time frame, right? So the time horizons also can vary. And then there have been other organizations that are more of social enterprises. So commercial, absolutely commercial, for-profit, but with a social element to it. And so you need to make sure that as a board, you're looking at both the commercial aspects, but also whether it stays true to its social mission and purpose. So hopefully that gives a bit of a flavor. We could also get into, for example, the nonprofit organizations also have boards, very important to have effective boards there. And in the case of nonprofit boards, same thing. You're dealing with public funds, you're dealing with beneficiaries, you're dealing with volunteers. So the levers are a little bit different. But back to the original point, there are, of course, commonalities as well.
So yeah, given the differences in strategic focus across sectors and organizations, what kinds of expertise should boards prioritize when building their own teams?
That's such a great question. I think what is most critical is to have clarity around the future direction of the organization. So if we start there and we say, well, where we're headed is X, and X might involve a geographic expansion, it might involve transformation into new business lines, it might require greater digitization or use of technology, it might involve culture change. I mean, just there, right? That's a very broad spectrum of potential ways that a company might be thinking about its future. So start with where are we headed in the future? Then based on where we're headed in the future, what kinds of skills, experience, capabilities do we need on the board? So once we've actually looked at that, let's then say, well, what do we currently have? And then where are those gaps that need to be filled? Right? But it really needs to start with the strategy of the organization, where it's trying to head to, and then constructing a board that brings those kinds of capabilities and experience.
So yeah, and the varying strategic focuses and the business dynamics you just mentioned bring their own sets of governance challenges. And I would love to explore how boards should navigate those. So you maybe you can share with us what are some common governance challenges you encounter across these different contexts, and how do these challenges influence the board's effectiveness in executing its strategy?
So governance challenges are, of course, very broad. I'll just use a few examples here. In a family business, for example, you might be thinking about, well, how do we go from the first generation to the second generation to the third generation? What does it mean in terms of the role of the family in both ownership as well as management, right? So shareholding versus management. And for the board, how can the board help the family navigate this process and be a complement to the family, in fact? So many family businesses will have both a board as well as a family board, a family council. So making a distinction between how you're looking at the family's interest versus the organization's interest. So these are situations where in that kind of ownership structure could be a governance challenge. You want to make sure at the end of the day that a board is there to provide checks and balances. So how do you ensure that you move the business forward without losing the family's ethos, right? The unique ethos, the values, and so forth. Other kinds of governance challenges, for example, regulatory shifts. As we think about the increased focus, for example, on ESG, what does that mean in terms of how, as a board, we make decisions? Decisions around investment, decisions around culture of the organization, culture of the board. Beyond regulatory dimensions, of course, there are other governance challenges which have to do with performance of the organization. So, how do we ensure that we're performing in a way that contributes to all stakeholders? So, there is a bit of a misconception that governance is about compliance alone. So, conformance and compliance to regulation is absolutely critical. So, don't get me wrong, that's really fundamental. But if you think about the role of a board in terms of overseeing strategy as well as sustainability of the organization, then what we really need to ensure we have in place is the combination of conform. So, are we conforming? And performance. So, are we performing? And are we transforming for the future? Because for many organizations, one of the biggest risks is, in fact, does the organization remain relevant for the future, right? Or are we going to be disintermediated? Are we going to be disrupted? And how do we protect against that risk? So in such situations, really it's about not just conforming to today, what's required, performing for the short term, but also the long term, but sometimes fundamentally shifting the direction of the business. So these are some examples of governance challenges that I think as a board director I've come across.
So yeah, I think what you just mentioned is fundamental. And another part maybe would be critical to consider is agility. As the governance landscape continues to evolve, how can boards remain flexible enough to adapt new trends while also staying aligned with the organization's long-term strategy?
One of the things that I've found really critical as a board director is to stay up to date. Because that's fundamental to agility, right? So, for example, we know that every business right now is asking itself questions around artificial intelligence and how that affects the organization. So, as a board director, you need to be very widely read. You need to understand what the regulations are shifting in terms of decarbonization. You need to understand the opportunities as well as the requirements to comply. So, agility actually comes from the ability to have a broad horizon scanning, to pick up on those patterns, and then to act based on that information. Now, sometimes it's not very clear. Precisely because things are moving very quickly. So, agility is the ability to then also place certain bets, to also run certain pilots, to actually see what actually transpires, and to be able to shift quickly. Now, shifting quickly is really hard, not only for boards, but for the entire organization. And this is where board dynamics come in, is being able to have the ability to have a point of view, but be willing to be open to be challenged and shift our own points of view as well. Right. So it sounds like a dichotomy, and it is. It is a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, you need to make sure that you have a clear perspective. On the other hand, be willing to be challenged ourselves, that the landscape may change and our perspectives may need to change. So the saying that I remind myself often is to have strong opinions weakly held.
We've been discussing how governance is evolving and the needs for boards to stay agile. But another key point of tension that often raised is the balance between governance and the actual management of the company. So where do you draw the line between governance and management, and how can boards avoid stepping into operational areas while still ensuring they have the right oversight to help shape and steer the strategy?
So clearly, the board's role is there to provide oversight. We often say, nose in, fingers out. So management's role is to implement and to ensure that we deliver against the strategic outlook. Having said that, I think just from my experience, it's actually really critical to have board and management work together. What do I mean by this? Again, it's very much of a balancing act. So, of course, you want a board that can challenge management. But at the same time, you also need to balance that against support for management. So, this support and challenge, push and pull is really critical. If you have a situation where the board is only supportive and is willing to go along with everything without questioning, without challenging, that's not a healthy board management dynamic. On the other hand, you can go to the other extreme where a board is challenging every single thing about management and, in fact, having a very confrontational or fractious relationship with management. And that's not productive either, right? So, fundamental to having this balance, as you put it, between agility as well as thinking about governance, is really about having that balance of these multiple dimensions.
So yeah, and we've discussed governance and agility, but I think another crucial aspect is accountability as well. So how can boards ensure accountability both in leadership and in achieving strategic objectives?
When you think about performance of an organization, I think it's really important to look not only at what is achieved, but also how it's achieved. So let me start with management. So, from a management perspective, obviously you need to look at financial performance, but that's not the only metric. I think increasingly organizations realize that in order to drive performance in the right way, you need to have the right kinds of metrics to ensure you don't have unintended consequences. So, for example, whenever I look at the headlines and there's some scandal in the news, the first thing I always ask myself is, was there a problem with the way the incentives were structured? Because if your incentives are structured in a particular way to incentivize growth at all costs, guess what? That's what you're going to get. You're going to get growth at all costs. You're going to get potentially cutting of corners. You're going to get potential ethical breaches. You're going to get all sorts of potential outcomes that are not intended. But would you get the metric that you're looking for? You might, right? So this is why having a balanced view of outcomes as well as how you achieve those outcomes is really important for management. Now, for the board perspective, I would say the same is true. Now, boards usually aren't measured in the same way, but I would also look at what the board is driving towards, as well as how the board accomplishes those outcomes. So, for example, board dynamics are really, really critical to achieving good outcomes. So, if you have a board culture where there isn't this healthy balance of support and challenge, you might end up with a situation where you come to a landing on a particular decision very quickly. So, is that effective? Well, it's efficient, but it might not necessarily be effective, right? And a more effective outcome might actually require that you get more perspectives, consider the different viewpoints, and then come to a landing that might be the same as where you started, but that might be a better outcome, even though it might not be as efficient. It might be a more effective outcome. So when we look at measuring how well a board performs, I would say, again, it is about balancing the outcomes as well as the process by which those outcomes are achieved.
So yeah, what if we look at the future? The business environment is changing rapidly, especially with technological advancement, evolving regulatory frameworks, and shifting stakeholder expectations. So maybe in your opinion, what emerging trends are shaping the future of corporate governance?
Certainly, you mentioned a few. So, and we've talked about a few as well in this conversation. Clearly, digital is going to have a huge impact on all organizations. And so I would say that's a key emerging trend. I would say, as I mentioned earlier as well, that ESG principles and the regulatory scrutiny around them will also be a key trend emerging. Well, it's no longer emerging, actually. It's a trend that's quite well embedded. I would say the third aspect that is on the mind of every board that I'm involved in is geopolitics, because that also has a link into everything from supply chain to talent to where you site your operations, which markets you choose to focus on, whether there is actually decoupling even of technological standards, again, depending what industry you might be on. So these are some of the areas that are absolutely on the mind of boards today. as we look out into the future.
So yeah, in terms of the technological part you just mentioned, what steps can boards take to stay ahead of technological advancement and ensure they're equipped to guide their organizations through digital transformations?
That's a great question. I think at one level, it is as board directors learning. So learning, reading about how the technology is evolving is really critical to be able to understand what's possible. Second, I would say, is to bring on people with capabilities in those areas onto the board. Because they would be able to provide, again, that particular lens. And I would actually say that that ties into a point about board diversity, broadly speaking. So we've talked about different perspectives. Of course, there are different lenses that people can bring in because they have different genders, but also different age profiles and different functional backgrounds. It's important to have people with legal backgrounds, with finance backgrounds, but also digital backgrounds, sustainability, communications, increasingly important. And I will also say human capital and organization background as well, because a lot of these shifts that are happening at the organization-wide level, driven by the board, will require significant culture change and transformation of the organization. So there's several layers of capabilities that are required. And again, for digital, at an individual level, there are things that we can do to learn, but at a board level, there are different things that we can do to diversify the profile. And then at a deeper level across the organization, enabling that change across the organization.
So yeah, and another areas that I would also like to explore more as well, which is ESG. Because with the growing focus on ESG, how can boards effectively integrate sustainability into their governance structures?
Several ways of doing that. One is some boards set up sustainability or ESG committees to focus more specifically on ESG issues. Other boards actually embed that into the entire board, being accountable for that. Other boards I've seen also include it within the audit and risk committee scope. So there are a number of different ways that you can do that. But I would say that at the end of the day, what makes the biggest difference really comes down to mindset and commitment. And so I find that is actually quite valuable for boards and organizations to say, well, for us at this stage in our development, what really moves the needle is these 2 or 3 dimensions, and then really focus on those 2 or 3 dimensions. So what really moves the needle, combination of 2 things. One is things that, aspects that perhaps are maybe a little bit more straightforward for the organization. So these are the low-hanging fruit that you would say, okay, these are things that are no-brainers who really just need to go down this direction. That's one dimension. On the other hand, you need to look at impact. You could do a lot of no-brainer, quote unquote, activities, but does it really have an impact? So putting those 2 dimensions together, impact against ease of implementation, to really focus on identifying 2 or 3 key areas and focusing on those first. Now, because ESG, as you build it into an organization, is also about building in systems, infrastructure, process, policy, capabilities. And all of this takes time to build out. And there is no organization with unlimited resources, right? So it's really about choosing an anchor to start with, and then over time building in new muscles to take on additional scope within the broad ESG umbrella.
So yeah, what about your thoughts on stakeholder expectations? Because I believe this is another key factors for leaders and boards to consider when shaping their approach to leadership in the future. So how do you think evolving stakeholder expectations will influence the way boards navigate leadership?
I would say that stakeholder expectations are constantly shifting, and it's important for an organization to be mindful of where those goalposts are. I do think that we are operating in a much more complicated environment. And sometimes those stakeholders are not aligned in terms of what they're looking for. And that's where a board needs to sometimes not just do A or B, but A and B in order to meet different stakeholder expectations. So your shareholders might have a certain set of expectations, your customers might have a certain set, your employees might have a certain set of expectations. The role of the board is to try and weave that together and to try and communicate really clearly why it is that these are actually not at odds, even though they may appear to be so. So, focusing on the areas of common concern and helping to articulate why, if we do something that appears on the face of it to only be solving for a customer concern or an employee concern, actually is helping us improve shareholder value in the long term, for example. Or how actually, if we are trying to adhere to a regulatory framework, it might actually be helping us operationally, which will then eventually translate perhaps into safety or better working conditions and so forth, which actually then translates into something that's good for employees or for customers, right? So there are many things that on the face of it appear to be at odds. The board's role is to try and connect those dots.
So yeah, and we've been talking about all these external changes, and I think you mentioned that leaders need to read widely. And maybe another really important piece of that is continuous learning. So maybe you can share with us, how can boards make sure their members are always learning and growing so they can stay agile and keep up with the industry trends and best practices?
I think having a broad radar and curiosity is sort of the foundation for continuous learning. There are lots of ways to learn. One can learn formally, one can learn informally, one can network with diverse groups of people, staying curious about emerging trends and best practices. And I think I'm certainly a fan of a combination of structured and unstructured learning. I think when we go through a bit more of a structured process, it provides frameworks, skeletons, in terms of how you think about a particular domain, and there's structure to it, which is good, right? And you can also think about it in terms of either a particular domain, whether it's cyber or human capital or sustainability. All of those are structured domains. And to go into each of those areas is very helpful. But the other thing I would also say is that actually it's also about learning about governance. On the one hand, being a board director, there are very few barriers to entry in the sense that technically anyone could be board director. On the other hand, I think as we think about professionalizing the profession of board directorship, it's actually really important to look at things like accreditation and to look at aspects around how do you actually stay up to date on an ongoing basis. It's not just about, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, I took a program and therefore I understand everything that I need to know. But it's actually about constantly staying up to date, and constantly, adding to the tank, right? So it's really about continuous learning. And, that's what we expect of doctors, right? When we have somebody who is a doctor, they're not only qualified as a doctor, but they also have a requirement to stay up to date with the profession. So I think it's the same for board directors in terms of continuous learning. So, get a baseline, get a base load, get certified, and then ensure that you're always committing to ongoing learning.
So yeah, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. We covered a lot of ground today, from strategic focus and governance challenges to the emerging trends that are reshaping the future of corporate governance. So as we wrap up, given all the changes and developments we discussed, what would be your key piece of advice for aspiring board member looking to stay relevant and effective in today's dynamic environment?
The first thing I would say is remember that governance is not only about compliance. It is about ensuring that, yes, we do conform, but we also drive performance and we also lead transformation. Second, for aspiring board directors, my advice would also be to build a diverse knowledge base as well as a diverse network. These two actually go hand in hand. the more similar we are, the more we're likely to have structural holes either in our networks or in our knowledge. So building a network isn't about just the quantity of people that we know, but actually the eclecticism of those people that we know so that we're filling gaps. If everyone that you know is very similar, even if you know lots of people and they're all similar, you aren't actually expanding that knowledge base or that awareness base. So I would say combination of those two factors would help drive the first point, which is understand how you need to actually drive sustainably for the organization, which is conform, perform, and transform. And to do that by having a broad knowledge base and a broad network.
Thank you again, Suyuan, for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. It's been a pleasure to learn from your experience. And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Criticaleye Asia podcast. We hope today's discussion has inspired you to think differently about governance and leadership in a rapidly changing world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.